Hey guys, this is your High Fist here with a new video. It's been a busy week. I haven't seen you guys in a while, but that sometimes happens, unfortunately. So we have the final concluding video of our trilogy today. As always, thank you to Steven Erikson for commenting on the last video and for sharing it as well. He left behind some really interesting comments about the bug in Reaper's Gale and kind of his general take on what the sort of underlying themes behind each of the books were. So I appeal to all of you to read it because it's very interesting, and I'm just so glad that we have this unique form of interaction with Erikson where he leaves behind a comment, because right? By the time when you see those two words, Erikson here, you know that it's not going to be some half-hearted cliche response. You know that it's not going to be some lukewarm or fake response. The comments that he leaves behind are always sort of meaningful in some way, heartfelt in some way. He sort of gives us some useful insight. Many of his comments have given me ideas for videos down the road. So I'm just glad we have this kind of unique form of interaction with him where he gets to post stuff. All of us get to see it more or less at the same time. All of us get to reply to it if we want to. And I hope that this dynamic continues, right? Because I don't know if it's common or not, but I think it's pretty rare to see an ongoing discussion like this between an author and a fan. So I guess we're just scratching the surface in that regard. Let's see how things go. So let's just get to the video, guys. This is a pretty controversial one, as you all know. It's about the Hobbling in Dust of Dreams. So by now, if you've seen the last two videos, you guys probably know where I stand on this. And you probably know where you stand on this as well, right? If you've seen the last two videos. So let's not flog a dead horse and just rehash the things that we kind of covered in the last two videos. What I thought I would do is, let me just look at or list out some of the arguments that I've heard against the Hobbling or the depiction of the Hobbling, and whether Erikson should have kind of even written that scene or not. And then let me give you what I think would be my counter argument for those, right? So if we look at the criticism that Erikson has faced over this, they typically tend to fall, in my observation, I might be wrong, right? They typically tend to fall under five variations, so to speak, five types of complaints. Is it five or four? I mean, let me see if I can list out five, right? The first is that it was unnecessary. The second is that it's gratuitous. The third is, why did it have to be Hetan, right? Why did it have to be her? The fourth is that the entire thing seemed a bit unrealistic, right? And that it just seemed like Tool and Hetan and all of them should have known that this was coming, but that they did nothing about this, right? And the last is, of course, this whole notion that fiction itself should not be depicting these things, that people just didn't want to read it, right? Why did I have to read that? That sort of argument. So let's just go through them one by one. Let's look at why people say that it was unnecessary, right? Usually, it tends to be, once again, in my opinion, the people who say it, once again, tend to be the types who seem to have forgotten that Erikson establishes very clearly when the series starts that this is not meant to be escapist fiction, right? That this is meant to be adult fiction. So was it necessary? Yes, it was. And that leads us to the second point, where people say it was gratuitous. And this, I think, is the easiest argument to counter, to rebut, because you don't really have to be a Malazan analyst, right, to kind of realize this. You just need to have a functioning brain to realize that Erikson's writing is not gratuitous. Whatever other complaints you might have over the Hobbling, it was not gratuitous. And if you have I don't mean to be harsh here, but I think anybody with a certain amount of kind of oxygen being pumped to their brain would kind of see through that. Show me one sort of instance in any of Erikson's depictions of sexual violence, including this, where he does things like talking about the jiggle of her breasts, or the width of her hips, or the curvature of her whatever, or the quivering of her lips, right? Erikson doesn't do that kind of stuff. That would be gratuitous, right? But Erikson always kind of describes these things in a very journalistic sense, and Erikson never really adds in stuff that is unnecessary, that kind of tries to objectify or sexualize the victim in any way. So I hope most people would agree with kind of our assessment that whatever other complaints you might have about this, that gratuitous is not one of them, right? The third point, which I think is a pretty common argument that's often made, is why did it have to be Hetan, right? Because she was kind of almost the embodiment of a bold, fierce, empowered female character, right? And she was bold in her sexuality as well. She was empowered in the way that she kind of flaunted her sexuality as well, right? And kind of, even though she gets a happy ending in the end, that's all out of her grasp, right? She gets a happy ending in the end because of circumstances that were far beyond her control. Unlike the two previous examples that I gave, especially Janath, right? Unlike Janath, who kind of wins through her willpower and intelligence, Hetan doesn't win, unfortunately. I mean, she does, as I was saying, get some slack at the end, but that is through complete divine intervention. And the Hobbling, in many ways, kind of makes us see the character in a different way, even when we reread the series, because we know exactly where it's going. And even the moments where we really enjoyed her in Memories of Ice, that is all just, when you reread it, tinged with this sense of despair and helplessness, right? When you just look at how free and wild and delightful she was, at least me, right? In Memories of Ice. But the argument against that, once again, just my opinion, is that the fact that people even ask why it had to be Hetan is itself, in my opinion, the answer to the question. As in, the fact that people even ask why it had to be her shows that there is a widespread tendency in readers, even today, in the modern world, right, where kind of there is no, and once again, guys, you know that I'm not a big compassion and empathy kind of guy, but this is a question of empathy, right, where it shows that many readers still lack any meaningful sense of empathy towards these victims, right? The fact that there would even be an argument of, why did it have to be someone that I know? Why couldn't it have been some faceless woman whom I didn't know? Why couldn't it have been some other, right, person? That to me is itself, as I was saying, the most sort of effective counter arguments against that question. It's there because it's realistic, and you need to realize, you as a reader going through the process of reading, right, kind of needs to understand or experience actual pain and actual things that happen in the world. Because if it was just, as many people say, some faceless Barghast woman, right, how many of us would have felt the same kind of empathy and kind of despair at that new faceless woman's suffering the way that we felt with Hetan, right? I would say that for many people, especially for the people who ask why it had to be her, their sense of suffering and helplessness would have been a lot less. And one of the important lessons to take out of the fact that it was Hetan is kind of for sort of us to know, and for us to see, for the readers to kind of look at this world and see that suffering is not monopolized by the faceless people you've never met, right? Everybody who suffers is a hetan in some way to someone, right? Every woman who experiences this is precious to someone else whose heart broke, or who felt helpless when something like this happens, right? The fourth is that the fourth criticism, as I was saying, is that many people say it was unnecessary, where both Tool and Hetan should have seen this coming, and that they kind of still went along with it. Once again, here, this is a question of narrative, right? Rather than a question of theme. It's a question of characterization rather than a question of theme. And here, I will kind of give it to the other side, right? Because I myself have, occasionally, I have these problems with the way that characters act in the series, where they go so overboard with their compassion and empathy, where they sometimes seem to throw common sense in the dustbin, and they sometimes seem to flush logical thinking down the toilet. That happens a lot, and in this case, I'm assuming sort of that happened as well, right? Because I have no logical answer for why Tool sort of did what he did, knowing what the consequences would be for his family. I have no idea why Hetan, being a war chief's daughter and knowing so much about Barghast's customs and apparently being such a smart woman, would not see something like this coming and wouldn't have been prepared for this, right? So that one I will concede, but once again, we've got to understand that the whole point of the Hobbling was to make certain statements, right? Which is what adult fiction does. It's not escapist fiction, right? This is what adult fiction does. It makes observations on life. It makes observations on about people, about culture, right? It gives us, the author tries to give us lessons that we can draw from history and life, and from the kind of the world of fiction that the authors created. So all of this happens a lot, right? So if you feel that the characters acted in a pretty sort of unintelligent way, I have no real answer for you, right? I agree with you, other than once again to point out that the purpose of this is not really to dissect whether people act in a rational manner or not. By the way, people in the real world make mistakes like that all the time, right? People in the real world steer away from what other people would consider to be the common sense path all the time. And then we come to the final point, right? Which is the role of fiction itself. Why do you need to read this? Why does stuff like this have to be in fiction? The very famous writer Doris Gallagher once pointed out that fiction has a very, very important role, and I touched on this in my George Orwell video as well. Fiction has an important role that most people underestimate. It allows us to kind of peek into another universe and often into our own history in a way that non-fiction can't, right? And a famous example that many people give us, if you want to know what it was like living in Russia, right? You don't pick up a textbook on the Russian Revolution. You read War and Peace, right? You don't read some non-fiction sort of X happened on date Y, this happened on date A, C happened on date D. That doesn't really give us any sort of real, genuine peek into what life was in Russia, just to use the War and Peace analogy, right? And Erikson's use of fiction is very similar in the sense that he manages to capture things that non-fiction cannot. And this is a great example of that, right? It's one thing for you to read books or reports, right, about things that I've mentioned in many videos before, right? The 93-94 genocide in Rwanda between the Hutus and the Tutsis, the 93 sort of ethnic cleansing in Bosnia, right? Or we can go into sort of East Timor, right? Or even what war crimes that have been committed by major superpowers in sort of countries like Georgia and Vietnam and things like that. So the list goes on, right? But the point that I'm trying to make is that in real life, what is being depicted here, which is the use of gang rape, right, as a tool of humiliation against a woman, has been recorded in almost all of these instances that I just gave, right? You can read the findings of the International Criminal Court, especially for Rwanda and Bosnia, since there were separate tribunals set up for each of those. But you can even go into general UNICEF and Amnesty International reports on the use of rape as a weapon, both as a weapon for societal hierarchies and as a weapon in warfare, right? There's a vast amount of literature, both feminist and international relations literature on this, right? So I appeal to all of you to read that, because that really gives us a sense of, I think Erikson made the statement in some interview that as sort of dark as his books may be, the real world is far worse, and that the things that happen in his book are not really as brutal as the things that happen in the real world. And if you read some of those reports and those judgments and the findings of the sort of the fact-finding groups and all that that went to those conflict zones, you will see that that is completely true, right? There are two more points that I want to touch, which is, the first is that something like the Hobbling is also a big statement on the state of epic fantasy fiction, particularly the state of what I would call, or what people seem to call, grimdark fiction, right? It's kind of like, remember the postmodern video that I made where the thumbnail was, there's nothing post or modern about Malazan? At least I've not read all the fantasy books out there, guys, but I've read many of the supposed grimdark authors, and all I can say is, for 9 out of 10 of those guys, there is nothing grim or dark about these supposed grimdark stories, right? I mean, listen, having the whole sort of anti-hero with a violent past, right? That's not grimdark. Just showing women get raped and just showing people get butchered is not grimdark, right? That's just violence, right? That's just graphic violence. Anybody can do that, right? But I would have always thought that grimdark was more about showing us the consequences of violence, sort of showing us violence and eliciting an emotional reaction from us, making us think about that violence, making us reflect on that violence. I would have always assumed, and having this real grim tone where anybody can die, where the real horrors of a conflict zone or of a genocide and things like that are demonstrated. That's what I would think grimdark fantasy is, right, or should be. But other than Erikson and very few other exceptions, look at the vast majority of the supposed grimdark works of fiction that you see, right? How many of them have something like the Hobbling, right? Despite this being, and sort of despite, as I was saying, the use of gang rape as a weapon and all that, despite things like that being so commonplace in the world today, how many other writers would touch on it in the stark way, in the grim way, in the dark way that Erikson would? I would venture that 9 out of 10 of them wouldn't, right? They just think having a hero, having like a, remember the movie Unforgiven, where Clint Eastwood is this bounty hunter or assassin or whatever with a dark past, and he's just sort of trying to be a good man now. It almost seems like many grimdark writers, right, seem to feel that just having that, of, oh, this guy used to be a senseless killer, right, and just seeing that makes it grimdark, and that just showing people being tortured and killed and all that for entertainment purposes to move the plot along, right? That is what is meant to be grimdark, right? So that's another observation. And the final observation I'd like to make about this is that there's a very important, one more important lesson for us to learn from this, right? Once again, guys, there's too disjointed, I know, but once again, I have no notes, right? I just had some free time, so I wanted to sort of make this video. So the final observation is, Hayton makes this as she was sort of being raped, right? She realizes that many of the women who were a part of that culture, right? Women who were there for her throughout her childhood, who took care of her kids, right? Who were there when she was kind of a girl becoming a woman, right? Whatever, flowering night or blooding night or whatever it's called, right? That all of these people now were against her. And this is another thing that we see very commonly, right? When society breaks down, when kind of the deeper nature of man, so to speak, comes out, right? One prominent example from the part of the world where I live in, sort of the partition of India and Pakistan, right? If you read almost every account of the partition of India and Pakistan, where the kind of where really brutal pogroms and riots broke out on both sides, you found Hindus and Muslims living side by side for generations, just slaughtering each other when this happened, right? And there are many books where there are very powerful and horrible stories, right, of just people being assaulted and their next door neighbor. Or there's a very famous story recounted in a very good book called Freedom at Midnight, which is one of the best books written about the India-Pakistan partition. There's a very good recount of a person who used to own a bakery, right? And during the riots, he was bashed over the head with it. He was a Hindu baker. He was bashed over the head with a stick. And as he was passing out, he sees a man who was his regular customer for over 25 years carrying his daughter away to be raped. And his bakery was burned down, right? And the same thing happened on the other side of the border, where in some cases it was the Hindus butchering the Muslims. In some cases, it was the Muslims butchering the Hindus, right? So this whole notion of the people that you've known all your life turning against you is a very common thing that we see when society breaks down. Another good example I can point out is stoning. The stoning of women, right? Which is once again a widespread practice in many parts of the world. I mean, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Afghanistan, right? Once again, Amnesty International has a good report on this, so you should check that out. I think it came out in 2017, so it's a pretty old report, but I mean, 2017 is still better than no report at all, right? So here, once again, people that the victims knew their whole lives, all publicly cheering and jeering as they throw stones at a woman who's been, whatever, accused of adultery or blasphemy or whatever, right? Stuff that in many parts of the world would not even be illegal, right? Where they are brutally, publicly stoned to death, right? And many of the people who do it are people who knew them, right? So this darkness in humanity also shines through in the Hobbling, and I think that's another sort of important message that it has for the rest of us, right? So that ultimately is, I guess, all the stuff that I needed to cover, guys. Oh yes, I mean, I guess there was one big criticism as well, that which was why did Haytan have to accept it? Right? Why did she have to kind of go through that? And once again, my answer to that would be that Erikson was staying true to the experience of many people who undergo this in real life, right? If every act of sexual violence was something where the woman did not blame herself, then that again would be inaccurate to the reality of sexual violence in the world. And once again, I would ask you to go through the war crimes tribunals reports and things like that, and even the reports of many UN sort of agencies and feminist scholars, by the way, right? Maybe I'll put down a few names in the description, right? Whose work might interest you guys. But that has been kind of recorded over and over again, where especially when you have a social punishment, we see this happening with the stoning of women, for example, where it's come to a point where they are so lost in despair and they've given up hope, where they themselves start accepting the social punishment that has been imposed on them. And it's once again, I think, important that stuff like that is highlighted in a series that wants to depict life honestly. in a series that wants to depict how people would behave, how societies would behave, and things like that in this, right? Erikson is not really going for the whole noble savage thing here. I mean, I think he's even stated that that was more why he did the whole Casa thing, that when he did this, it was not the whole noble savage point that he was making, but that plays into all of this as well, right? You cannot deny that there are many cultures in the world, as I was just pointing out, who do stuff like this, right? Where acts of violence, kind of like the hobbling, right, are pretty common. And it's happening even today. These are not things that went extinct thousands of years ago. This level of brutality is matched by people like you and I around the world today. And sanitizing it would be a great disservice to the people who went through that, right? And sort of us always having to depict many of these cultures as these, romantic heroes. I think that does far more harm to the conversation on culture than good, because I think we all kind of understand that politically, culturally, in terms of the exchange of ideas and all that, many parts of the West are in a very crucial stage at the moment where they are having many conversations about race and racial equality on many different levels. And while all those conversations should be welcomed, while all those conversations hopefully will yield to good results where sort of minorities are no longer mistreated and things like that, it's equally important for us to not kind of fall prey to this dichotomy that people sometimes try to push into us, or push on us rather, that some of us savages are noble and that many of you, whatever, white European Americans or Canadians or whatever, are evil. That needs to be resisted as well, because intellectual honesty is a very important part of empowerment. And sort of many of this these noble savage stereotypes, often I have observed they do far more harm than good, right? So it's important for us to have writers like Erikson who not only have a very complex understanding of society, of way cultures function, of way civilizations function, but who are also willing to kind of risk their own reputation for the sake of intellectual honesty, for the sake of showing us that even these savage cultures, right, in many ways they are just like us, in the sense that some of them are good, some of them are bad. In some ways, the savages are better than the civilized, and in many ways, the civilized are better than the savages, right? There's a reason they're called savages. It's because of things like the hobbling and tribal warfare, tribal cannibalism, the use of gang rape, right? The use of mutilation, all the things that we would consider to be completely bizarre. I think the word that many people used for the hobbling that some reviewers and readers use was bizarre. It's not bizarre at all. In fact, what is bizarre is that many people don't really realize the importance of this, right? So, guys, I know this was very disjointed, but hopefully there was enough in there to give you guys some food for thought, right? Those are essentially all the things that I wanted to say about the hobbling. And while it was probably not structured that well, once again, I hope you got my point, right? So thank you, and I'll see you guys next time.